George Floyd was a man who was accused of passing a counterfeit bill, $20 bill, um, for the act of trying to use supposedly a counterfeit bill. This is an allegation. It was never proved because he died. He was picked up by the police. A police officer put his knee on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George Floyd died. This is part of a cycle of violence by the police. An earlier incident 6 years ago, when in New York City, Eric Garner was selling allegedly loose cigarettes. Now, this is an excise law that you can't open a packet of cigarettes and sell them loose. You have to sell them intact. Eric Garner was allegedly selling loose cigarettes in the streets of New York. When police officers caught him, threw him on the ground, sat on top of him, he also yelled, "I can't breathe," and he died. It's important to remember two things about these two deaths. And between them, 1,000 people plus have been killed in a like manner between 2014 and 6,000 people have been killed in a like manner. There are about 500 police killings of this kind a year in the United States. It's important to know that. But the Eric Garner case and the George Floyd case are important to keep in mind. They are part of this cycle of police violence. But I want to emphasize just a few things. One is the extreme violence used by the police. Now, they didn't shoot either of them, but it is far more brutal to be on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and listen to them say, "I can't breathe," and have no human feeling. And essentially, you are strangling them right there in public, in daylight, with cameras on you. Extreme police violence, that's one feature I'd like you to consider. Secondly, this extreme police violence seems to be meted out decidedly against certain communities. In this case, African Americans. You also see this kind of violence against people of Latino descent from South and Central America and the Caribbean. So one, extreme police violence. Second, against specific populations, this violence is quite harsh. There's of course violence against whites, killings of whites and so on. But this kind of extreme cruelty seems to be reserved for black and brown bodies. That's the second point. The third point is that what many of these killings have in common is that these are killings of the working class struggling to survive. In one case, passing a counterfeit $20 bill. In another case, selling loose cigarettes. One feature is the working class struggling to survive is killed when it tries to survive. Then the other feature is people with mental health challenges, schizophrenia, loss of medication for various things, in public, creating some sort of disorder, often black and brown people shot to death. So I just want you to understand these three different features of these killings. One, extreme cruel violence by the police. Secondly, the most extreme cruelty is meted to black and brown bodies. And thirdly, it's meted often to people who are either struggling to survive or who have severe mental health challenges for which there is no public health system to take care of them. In other words, this is not just an assault of a racist character. This is an assault on the black and brown working class in conditions of essentially capitalist cannibalism, because capitalism has cannibalized the social structure. There's no real welfare net anymore, and there's no public health system. So people struggling to survive go out there and hustle for a living, whether they are selling loose cigarettes, which is hardly a crime that deserves a death penalty, or they join some sort of gangs, or they do certain kinds of activity, passing counterfeit bills and so on. On the other hand, black and brown bodies from the poor cannot access private health care, lose access to medications. Many of them struggle with various forms of health challenges for reasons of poor nutrition, exposure, because they may be sleeping outside and so on. And that second set is equally important because there are many cases of police firing on somebody having a schizophrenic episode in public. and often black and brown bodies. So these three features very important to bring out from the George Floyd incident. This is not just an issue of racist violence. This is entirely violence against a collapsed system. It demonstrates that the system is just collapsed. I want to make a moral point again here before I go back historically, and then I'll link this with the United States' broad problem in the world. The moral point I want to make is that these episodes of violence come in cycles. They come every few months. For different reasons, they provoke two kinds of immediate response from people. One is they provoke anger. I mean, people who knew Eric Garner, they were not going to sit in their homes and say Eric Garner is killed. He was a gentle giant, beloved person, took care of his family. His daughter, Erica Garner, died a few years ago, almost of a broken heart. They loved their father. He was struggling to make a living to help their family. And again, I just want you to think about this. He was selling loose cigarettes, or at least alleged to be selling loose cigarettes on the street. Hardly a crime that deserves a death penalty. So one set of protests that emerge is just motivated by anger. And that's the protest that often becomes rioting. People come out, they're very angry, often very poor, deprived, great feeling of deprivation. And there's a history in countries like the United States for this anger to emerge into looting. And that's what happens. Nobody organizes it. It's not a strategy of any organization. It merely is a reflection of the collapsed nature of the capitalist system. Looting, in fact, is symptomatic of the cannibalization that capitalism has wrought against the social lives of the working class, particularly of black and brown bodies. So that's one form of protest that takes place. It's anarchic in its character, and it often is utilized by the capitalist state as a reason for the police to come in with even more force, which again creates another cycle of violence. Second set of protests that have emerged since the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2015, 5 years ago, when this man was walking down the street. The police officer accused him of having done a crime, which he may or may not have done. And because Michael Brown wasn't submissive enough to the police officer, and indeed, why should he be? Why should a human being walking down the street essentially fall on his knees because a police officer has told him, get on your knees? Why should you do that? You're a human being. Police officer is merely an agent of the state, has no right to tell you to submit yourself in a humiliating way. A white police officer telling a black man to get on, and the officer shot him. There was an immense protest in Ferguson. Again, the first kind of protest emerged, the rioting. It's uncontrollable. It's a natural reaction. It's the system that produces the rioting. It's not the rioting that emerges from outside the collapse of the system. But the second set of protests, which start from Ferguson, are very interesting, because these are protests that are not organized by, political parties, trade unions, or anybody. They're not organized by small left organizations, although the left organizations joined these protests. These were protests organized by residents of the kind of what are known as projects or the slums where people like Michael Brown, Eric Garner, George Floyd live. These are their neighbors and friends and so on. And they were often organized by young black women who created immediately some sort of Facebook page or went door to door in their project, brought people on the street, somehow found access to megaphones, and they marched down the street and confronted the police directly. Now, this is interesting. It's a new wave of protest that has become quite significant. After the death of George Floyd, across the United States, again, there was this wave of anarchic rioting, which is a natural reaction. In a collapsed capitalist system, it's a natural reaction. It's not, again, I really want to emphasize, it's not like anybody needs to organize a riot. Riots happen spontaneously because they are a natural reaction to capitalism that has cannibalized society. So that, of course, happened after George Floyd's murder. But on the other hand, again, young black women almost spontaneously, but the word spontaneous has too much of a charge to it because this was not spontaneous, but almost spontaneously called for protests, organized protests, in which tens of thousands of people came on the street in each city. Now, what's interesting is they came onto the streets of the cities angry about police violence, and quickly they created the phrase defund the police. And this is where I'm going to make, as I said, a moral point about this idea: defund the police, stop funding police departments. In this last period, from the last 40 years, in this neoliberal period, when budgets have been basically under a kind of austerity order, in this period, social welfare has been cut, public health policies have been cut, but spending for police has increased, ballooned. And I was saying it's not only the police spending that's increased, but also military spending for US overseas operations. I mean, the US military budget is somewhere between $700 billion and $1 trillion. And the reason I give you this range is because there is an enormous secret budget that goes to the National Security Agency, that goes to the CIA and so on. We just don't know what the numbers are. But there are estimates that suggest the official budget of $732 billion has to be supplemented by at least $200 billion. So I'm saying it's up in a range between $700 billion and $1 trillion. When machines for war get superseded, because you can't use the stuff that you're buying for $1 trillion a year every year. You just can't drop enough bombs, and you can't wear out enough tanks and so on. A lot of that machinery is resold every year to police departments, so that when the military gets these deployment vehicles, for riot control in Baghdad, for instance, the next year they're going to get more money to buy more of them. So then they start selling these off to police departments. So in US streets, the police department now looks like a foreign occupation force. They wear body armor, just like special forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. And they have vehicles that look like they patrol streets where the United States is in active war. So police departments have been heavily funded in this period, and they've been buying military technology. They also, by the way, have been trained by people like the Israelis. You might have seen in Britain, Rebecca Long Bailey, Shadow Education Secretary, Labour Party member, tweeted about how the Israelis had trained the Minneapolis Police Department, and the new head of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, fired her from her post for this, because apparently that's called anti-Semitism. In other words, if you make any factual claim about Israel, you can be accused of anti-Semitism. Anyway, police departments have received military training, paramilitary training, and so on. But the moral point I want to make is this, and this applies to capitalist states around the world. You see, here you have food in a shop, in a grocery shop, or whatever. You have food here. And there's enough food in the world. We know that. Over here, you have hungry people. You have people like Eric Garner and his family. Eric Garner and his family need to get to the food. In a humane society, you would find a way to get Eric Garner the food. The food would be distributed to his family because they need to eat. They need adequate nutrition so that they can do productive things with their life. And by productive things, I don't mean necessarily go and get a job, but they can contribute to society. So in a humane society, a state would have as its task the moving of food from the end of a supply chain to hungry people. But in a capitalist society, you have food over here in a shop, it's commodified. You have Eric Garner here with no money. So Eric Garner, if he has no money, cannot access the food. Rather than use the social surplus to get Eric Garner the food, you hire police forces and militarize them to stand between Eric Garner and the food. That's a moral choice that society has made. Society has decided, and by society, of course, I mean those who have power over society and the state. Society has decided, or those who have power over society have decided, that it's a better use of social surplus to hire massive police departments, treat them like a military, and make them stand in a phalanx, in a row, in front of the food to prevent people like Eric Garner and company from eating. That's a better use of social surplus as far as a capitalist society is concerned than to use that social surplus to just find a way for Eric Garner to get food. Because Eric Garner is not trying to go and rob the rich. He's not a radical. George Floyd wasn't trying to go and rob the rich. They were trying to get basic survival, food, and so on. So capitalist societies, their great decadence is that they prefer to protect food, because food is private property, from hunger. They prefer to protect food than to protect the lives of the hungry. That's the moral compass of a capitalist society. Capitalism prefers to protect dead food rather than living humans. That's the nature of its society. I mean, that's how I understand it. And that's exactly what you need to understand to know why the call has come from these protests to defund the police. Because what people are saying when they say defund the police, they're saying that there's lots of things that the police is doing in a capitalist society that's immoral. Why should the police stand in a wall preventing people from getting food? Why not use the money that you're using to hire a police department to deliver food to people? Or instead of having so many police officers, why not have a better public health system? Not only would that have helped during the coronavirus, but it would also help people who are struggling amongst the poor with health challenges, which bring them into public places where they create, disorder of various kinds and provoke, I suppose, from the standpoint of the police, violence against themselves. That's how the police sees it. They are, of course, merely having a schizophrenic episode. They are not trying to get the police to shoot them. But there's nobody to take care of them. There's no medical system. So people say, why not defund the police and fund public health or social workers? Or why not reach food to people? But you see, this demand to defund the police is a fundamental criticism of the capitalist system, because it questions the idea that health and food should be commodities, that healthcare should be turned into something that you have to buy and sell, and that food should be something you have to buy and sell. There is actually no need in terms of human life to commodify food or health. It's social labor that produces these things. There's no need for private appropriation to come in between social labor and social accumulation or social use. There's no need. There's no need to commodify these things. It's not necessary. Now it seems ridiculous to say so, because capitalism has commodified most of everything. So it looks normal to commodify food, but there's no reason to commodify it. You can imagine a system where food is not commodified like this. Different ways of organizing the production of food in cooperatives, different ways of creating supply chains, and then the provision of food to people. After all, the public distribution system is a crude version of something like this, where you can decommodify, although it was not entirely a decommodified system. So the claim to defund the police is a radical claim against the system. And it has provoked much more violence from the police and from people like Donald Trump and so on, who have declared that the protesters are emerging because of outside agitators, particularly anti-fascist groups and so on. He wants to make the Antifa organization, which is not really an organization, into a terrorist organization. So they understand, people like Trump and the Democratic Party understand that this is a very much dangerous situation, because the demands have escalated beyond merely police reform. The demands have escalated to the heart of the political economy of the United States. But of course, it's complicated, because in search of, and because of the kind of cultural, blanket that covers over much of US and Western European politics, there's been a pivot from defund the police to get rid of the statues. So you see in Britain, in Brighton, the statue of the man who owned human beings, Edward Colson, was thrown into the River Avon. Yesterday, on the 4th of July, which is Independence Day in the United States, in Baltimore, activists cut down a statue of Christopher Columbus and threw it into the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, long overdue, in my opinion. Somebody wrote outside Westminster in London, racist, statue of Winston Churchill. All things that are absolutely necessary. But you see, it's not enough. The question of these statues and so on, it's not enough. Because that's to go after the way in which a society dignifies wretched people. It's important to do that, yes, but more is needed, much more. And the movement hasn't gone from defund the police to that other area. It's gone from defund the police to get rid of the statues, which I fear might divert it away from a more radical agenda. And the more radical agenda is the agenda that calls for questions of reparations. If you take descendants of people who had been enslaved, not only in the United States, but in the Caribbean, in Western Europe, and so on, in Brazil, enormous population. If you take that in hand, then the question is, there are hundreds of years of back wages that need to be considered. Hundreds of years of back wages. And on the other hand, hundreds of years of accumulation of capital by white elites. And so after the end of the enslavement of people, there was no reconciliation with the former people whose bodies were used in slavery and whose lives were ruined by that terrible system, brutal system. There was no reconciliation. On the other hand, by the way, these regimes, they give reparations to those who owned human beings. So, for instance, Haiti, after the glorious revolution of the Haitian people throughout the planters, in the tail end of the French Revolution, much more radical than the French Revolution. And I'm very sorry to, see how we know so much about the French Revolution, which, collapsed into Napoleon. But we know so little about the Haitian Revolution, which in many ways was the first working class revolution, where plantation workers who had been enslaved rose up in these factories of fields, rose up and overthrew the plantation class and created the first free republic of people of African descent in the Americas. When Haiti won its independence, the French forced the Haitians to pay an indemnity, to pay for their freedom. They had to pay the French, and those payments of, I think it's 90 million French francs, went all the way to 1947. So for 200 years, the Haitian people paid the French back for their human freedom. I mean, that's disgraceful. No French planter paid the people who had been enslaved back their back wages for hundreds of years. That was not on the cards. I mean, this is how imperialism continues, despite the emancipation of Haiti in the early 1800s. In Jamaica, after the Great Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865 and so on, people won their freedom. Slavery was abolished. The British government, at the day of abolition of slavery, agreed to pay the planters, the British planters in Jamaica, for the loss of their property. In other words, actual, real, living human beings. And the British government continued to pay these white planters and their descendants until the 2010s. Just a few years ago, they stopped paying them. Over 7 trillion pounds was paid to the descendants of Jamaican planters for the loss of their human property, which is human beings. But nothing was paid to the Jamaicans. On the other side, by IMF pressure, Jamaica has been forced to hold public sector wages down to 9% of GDP. As a consequence, Jamaica, which has an excellent education system, produces a great number of people in the professions. I'll take one example, which is nurses. Nurses are very well trained in Jamaica. There's a large number of nurses trained in Jamaica. because the IMF forces Jamaica to hold down its public sector wages at 9% of GDP, and because most medical care in Jamaica is in the public sector, nurses are very poorly paid. And then comes the National Health Service from the United Kingdom, private hospitals from the US. They recruit nurses from Jamaica and take them out. So here is a country which wins its independence, but the price of human emancipation was that the British Exchequer paid their oppressors until just a few years ago. Meanwhile, the British Exchequer, the United States Treasury Department pressures the IMF to keep public sector wages down in Jamaica today and watches as nurses come and work in New York City and in London. Now, why am I giving these two examples? And I'm moved away from the United States for a minute, precisely the United States for a minute, because I want to show, because these are very clear-cut examples, that there's one thing to have freedom from bondage, from enslavement, say, that takes place in the United States around 1865. It's one thing to have freedom from enslavement, to abolish slavery, and it's another to essentially reconcile with people for hundreds of years of wages not being paid. So in the United States, after the end of slavery, there was a period called Reconstruction. Certain promises were made to those who are now free, but the promises were not kept. And the United States then enters into a period of Jim Crow, so-called separate but equal. That is, that blacks and whites will have separate facilities. They were supposed to be equal, but they were not. And there were many, many studies to show they were not equal. And there was no reparations or back wages paid to either the people who were actually enslaved or their descendants. No back wages paid. So the structure of American capitalism, just as the structure of the Commonwealth capitalism, let's take, because you can't take Jamaica alone. You have to see Jamaica in relation to the United Kingdom or Haiti in relation to France. The structure of capitalism was born out of the theft of wealth and wages from concrete workers. These are real workers who worked, received no wages. They received a small amount of food to reproduce themselves for the next day. In fact, their children were taken from them as property and sold in the market. So they were not even, they didn't even need to give them enough resources for them to, for family reproduction. That was not necessary. The children would be taken and sold. Small plots of land to sleep on, small amount of resources to just survive. You can work in the plantation the next day. No back wages for hundreds of years. The capitalism is structured, as Eric Williams writes in a fabulous early book on capitalism and slavery. He was the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams. Highly recommend his book. As Eric Williams writes long time ago, capitalism was structured by the theft from black and brown bodies. And then capitalism continues to reproduce this inequality over the centuries because you have people who are permanently dispossessed from capital, permanently dispossessed. They never get back wages. They never get reparations. In fact, the opposite. They're kept in positions of utter dispossession, and every generation then struggles to survive and is the, I don't even know if we can use a term like reserve army of labor, because a large section of this population is essentially a surplus population. It's not that necessary for capital accumulation, has become external to capital accumulation. So when you look at somebody like George Floyd, he comes at the end of this long process where these populations, particularly when United States saw the globalization of its production as global supply chains become more important, and US labor becomes less crucial. US labor becomes sidelined to some extent. You know, when Lenin was writing in Imperialism, he talked about these aristocratic wages, but he said for a small section of the workforce. It's often misunderstood what Lenin writes about the labor aristocracy. He didn't mean that all the workers in England were a labor aristocracy. He says a small section of the working class becomes a labor aristocracy, they typically will dominate the unions, and they will make the union movement reformist in that society. That's what Lenin's point was. But the bulk of the workforce is still struggling to survive. There's nothing aristocratic about their lives. And this is not just in Lenin's time. Of course, it was there even before Marx seriously started to study the political economy of England. This was there in the first major work from Engels on the condition of the working class in Manchester. Much the same way in the United States, yes, there is a labor aristocracy, absolutely, but then there is a section of the workforce highly precarious, and this is the section that is now increasingly entering these protests, this cycle of protests, very precarious section. And then there's a section that sees itself as completely surplus. And in that section, you will find Eric Garner, George Floyd, and so on, for whom the possibility of entering even precarious workforce is no longer available. It is a class that it has a revolving door from prison to slum and lives in a condition of great deprivation and stress. And it is there where police violence is the most ruthless against this population. A study done by the US Federal Reserve about maybe 3-4 years ago, a survey, showed that Americans have only about $400 per family in case of emergency. So if you're out of work for 2, 3, 4 months, you simply don't have the savings to survive. And so this surplus check that is coming from the government, $600 check, that is absolutely a lifeline, and that's going to end at the end of July. So there is a kind of hollowed out nature of US society, which is amplified, as I said, in the sections of the surplus population. There's a hollowed out feeling. But in an imperialist country, the internal collapse is important because you don't want the costs of protest to rise too much, because then you have to put more resources into tamping down, unrest in the country, maybe increase welfare spending and so on, just to ensure that you're not paying any domestic cost for your overseas adventures. Trump is very smart to pivot into this anti-China thing, because that's been able to suggest to a considerable amount of the population that the problem isn't Trump, but it's China. This bellicosity, this militarism, and so on, it benefits Trump. But it's also real. And I want to talk about the reality of this in order to go back to the history of imperialism. It's real. One of the sectors in the United States that is deeply concerned about what's happening in China is the tech sector, Silicon Valley and so on, the big tech companies, Google, Facebook, Alphabet, etc. And then Microsoft and these firms, including all the companies in telecommunications, very afraid that China has developed new systems of telecommunications and chips and so on that might have a 3-4 generation advantage over the United States. The test case here is Huawei. You might know that Huawei's chief financial officer left Beijing. She was transferring flights in Vancouver to fly to South America because Huawei is making a big expansion in South America. She was arrested in Vancouver airport, is being held there under an extradition process to be brought to the United States to be charged with fraud and so on. So Huawei is expanding around the world because there's a claim, have better technological devices and 5G and so on over American and European firms. So Trump understands this very well, and his pressure against Huawei is to use political, diplomatic, military, in other words, imperialist pressure to prevent China from breaking through against Western tech companies and taking a generational advantage, at least for now. That's what they are quite openly saying. They don't want to give China an advantage, and they're using various incidents as the way to push their advantage. For instance, one of them is that Chinese tech companies do surveillance. That's an interesting claim to make. It's particularly interesting because Edward Snowden, the National Security Agency contractor who defected from the United States and revealed all this material and now lives in Moscow, Edward Snowden demonstrated with government material and contractor material that in fact it's American tech firms that are entirely in collusion with the security agencies in the United States. So they are already allowing surveillance of the population, but it's the US government that's doing the surveillance. And there is a racist idea that somehow when the Americans are doing surveillance, it's benign. When the Chinese are doing surveillance, it's malevolent. Well, you can pick your poison. It's not an interesting discussion, but the United States is using that fear, mobilizing that argument to put pressure on the United Kingdom, European countries not to adopt Huawei technology and so on. And this is, of course, the case as well in India. India, incredible. Retaliation for Galwan will not use Chinese apps. And the question the Chinese must be wondering is, which Indian apps should we delete? That's a good question to ask the Prime Minister. How many Indian apps do you have on your phone? At any rate, Chinese technological advancement as a consequence of a very smart way of opening the country up to foreign capital. In the 1980s, Chinese government essentially told foreign companies, this is totally unlike what the Indian government did, you can come in and set up solar battery production, but you have to tell us what you're doing. In other words, we need science and technology transfer. That's part of the price you have to pay if you're going to come into Shenzhen and so on. And when these European companies shared their information, science and technological information, well, the Chinese went and they perfected it. And so now China is the biggest producer of solar materials, and that is why European companies have taken Chinese firms to the WTO, saying that they have stolen from us. Well, no, you signed an agreement to transfer technology that's different from theft, different from espionage. So this is a great worry. And so they are using extra economic force, essentially military force, the Indo-Pacific strategy, Millennium Challenge grants, putting pressure on the government in Nepal to the breaking point for that government, moving India, Japan, which has recently declared that it's not going to pursue a missile defense, but wants to pursue a first strike capability, putting pressure on Australia, these so-called Quad countries, to squeeze China. They will use the security law in Hong Kong as another reason to squeeze China, even though, by the way, the Hong Kong situation is a whole other complicated world. It's not as clear-cut as people say. I mean, it would be, if you in India have a problem with the situation in Hong Kong, you should ask yourself what happened when the Indian Army went into Goa. When the Indian Army went into Goa, that was seen as bringing Goa back into the framework of India. The China-Hong Kong thing is very similar to that, but that's a separate issue. In Washington Bullets, what I was interested in doing, and by the way, it's available as an ebook from the Leftword site. What I was interested in doing in that book is telling the long history of US imperialism, going back to the so-called founding of the United States of America, because from that early period, there's a misunderstanding of what happened. In 1776, when the United States of America is founded, it's not founded on an anti-colonial foundation. It's actually founded on a colonization principle. That's the basis of the United States of America being created. What do I mean by that? The British King George III, did not want the colonies to move beyond the Mississippi River. I mean, they were to stay along the coastline from, roughly Virginia up to New Hampshire and Maine. That was the idea, the 13 colonies. But the emerging industrial and aristocratic landed bourgeoisie, the landed bourgeoisie of these 13 colonies was interested in expansion, but they were being prevented by the British to expand. The moment they threw off the British yoke, they started expanding, and you saw the Indian wars coming in much greater frequency. And the United States of America then expands all the way out to California, where it also fights this very important war against Mexico in 1846 and takes about a third of Mexican land, which includes California, Arizona, New Mexico, and a large part of Texas. So the US imperial project is not an overseas project until 1898, roughly. From 1776 to 1898, it's a contiguous territorial project. It is the expansion of the United States of America on this vast territory where it had not had title. This included the purchases of Alaska, of Louisiana from the French, and so on. But a lot of it was by warfare against many, many Native American tribes, the genocide against the native peoples, the war against Mexico, and so on. In 1898, the United States goes further afield, captures Hawaii, captures Philippines, captures Cuba, captures Puerto Rico, and so on, and then expands to have a territorial empire. And that is when Rudyard Kipling writes his poem, The White Man's Burden. What he's essentially writing is a resident of Vermont. By then, Rudyard Kipling is writing a poem saying the United States has a burden, a charge to be out there to go and civilize the planet alongside the British. That was the idea. So what I do in Washington Bullets is I show how the United States government, from the 1770s right till the overthrow of the government of Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2019, develops basically a grammar of political action on the world stage, which includes hybrid wars and so on. It produces a grammar to subjugate countries in order to advantage its capitalist enterprises. And for a long period, these are capitalist enterprises that have an American flag. That's still the case, that many of the advantaged capitalist enterprises have a US flag, but they are also working on behalf of global capital, of their allies. So this new imperialist encirclement of China that's taking place, this is not just happening, for human rights and so on. This is happening on an economic foundation for many reasons. One, it's almost a replay of the Opium War, where the United States and the West is deeply frustrated that China is able to run huge surpluses and they are so-called draining their wealth to China. It's the same thing that the British worried about in the 19th century when they felt that they were draining their silver, which they had robbed from South America through the Spanish and Portuguese. They were draining their silver to the Chinese in order to buy tea, and which is why they substituted for silver opium, which they grew in Bihar and Bengal. And they dumped opium on the Chinese. They fought 2 wars to force the Chinese to take the opium for the tea. They didn't want to give silver anymore. And now in the same way, the Americans, they are quite happy to have Chinese labor produce iPhones, but they don't want Chinese phones, the Huawei and so on, to go on the world market. The moment China moved from merely labor for Western companies to Chinese companies producing for the global market, that was an unacceptable qualitative shift in China's role in the world. It's not that they want to shut China down. They want to bring China back to being merely the labor or working class of their companies. That's acceptable to them. So this is, again, extra economic power being used here. There is no chance for the United States to see its companies return to territorial the US. And now I'm wrapping up. There's no chance. At Tricontinental, we did a calculation of what it would cost to make an iPhone in the United States, paying basically minimum wage to American workers. Instead of $300-400 for a new iPhone, it would cost in the tens of thousands of dollars, depending on what model. This is beyond the capacity of the world market to absorb a phone that costs so much. So there is a huge arbitrage calculation made by global capital that wants labor that is artificially cheapened across borders elsewhere. That means that the possibility of jobs for George Floyd and possibility of jobs for Eric Garner are virtually zero. They will not have jobs. That is a permanent condition. That's why I talk about a surplus population created. Rather than use the resources of society to transfer food from the shop to the house of Eric Garner, you hire a police force to stand between the private property, food, and the mouths of hungry people. And if these people try to find a way to survive, then you kill them. 8 minutes and 46 seconds on somebody's knee. This is the nature of imperialism. It doesn't have to all make complete sense because there are contradictions in the system. This is not a formula where the one side of the equation equals the other side and everything is balanced. No, there are contradictions in the system. Things don't always make sense. And it's these contradictions in the system that create the hollowing out of life in the United States, and they create the immense expansion of a police force, and they lead to these grotesque deaths, which have now provoked a cycle of protests, unpredictable cycle of protests. They come during the year of a presidential election. It's very hard to say what's going to happen in the next few months. You shouldn't underestimate Trump and what he's doing. And also, this is not a personalized issue because these are policies. And these policies are fairly, they don't diverge too much. Like the policies between a Trump administration and a Biden administration, especially on the imperial question, is basically identical. You're not going to see much difference. Like Biden on China is perhaps even more to the right of Trump on China. Biden on Venezuela is perhaps more to the right of Trump on Venezuela. When John Bolton, who is truly an insane person, when John Bolton released his book that attacked Trump, Trump said publicly that Bolton is crazy. He just wants to bomb the whole world. Now, this doesn't mean Trump doesn't want to bomb the whole world, but they may want to bomb the whole world in different sequences. So the gap between Biden, who is also very militaristic regarding China, and understands full well that the rise of China is not just a it's not just a geopolitical, it's not just like that, like it's rising. No, it's an actual genuine threat to the kind of capitalist order organized since the 1990s, where the fundamental principle that holds that capitalist order together is the new idea of intellectual property rights, based on the product, not on the process. And that enabled firms like Nike to no longer need to produce anything and to subcontract production completely because they control the entire process through the rents that they collect against the intellectual property rights. It's other people making investment risks, small factories in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and so on, that take the investment risk. Nike doesn't invest in them. And when these firms send the shoes up the value chain, as the shoe finally is sold, it's valorized, that profit comes to Nike. Enormous profits, super profits come to Nike. They just claim profits against their rent. They're collecting rent actually against their intellectual property. Their role in extracting surplus value is not there. And so these firms recognize, this entire system of capitalism recognizes that violating this new principle of intellectual property and so on is a great threat. That is why they go around the world trying to police piracy and so on, violations of intellectual property. On all of this, the Democrats and Republicans are completely joined. There's no daylight between them, none at all. And so then it's useful to see that it's not only between Republicans and Democrats, there's no gap between the Canadians and the United States. So on US imperial policy on South America, Canada actually takes the lead ahead of the United States because more than 70% of mining companies in the world are headquartered in Canada. So Canada, which has enormous interests in Bolivia, in Venezuela, and so on, is in the lead for regime change in South America. And it goes ahead of the United States. The United States will be with Canada. So when they created the Lima Group in Peru to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, the Canadians played a role here. I'm saying all this just in order to make the point that when we think about the logic of imperialism now, its shape is different than it was 100 years ago. But what's going on is quite similar. That's why I often reference Lenin's book on imperialism in 1916, because I think the broad analysis is, very much alive and well today. Even though, of course, the system is quite different. When he was writing in 1916, you didn't have this kind of disarticulated production. You didn't have the centrality of intellectual property rights, as the linchpin for the collection of rents against production and so on of goods, production and sale of goods and so on. So one thing to remember is that the way in which the imperialist structure works today, it greatly advantages large corporations who have basically the entire political class on their side. There's almost no major political party that will take the side of a George Floyd. What they might say is that it should not be done so vulgarly, like that he should have been arrested. In fact, Joe Biden said that why don't you shoot people in the foot rather than strangling them like that? I mean, as if that's adequate. Like if I'm accused of passing a $20 counterfeit bill, is the punishment that is acceptable that I get shot in the foot? Marx, when he was writing his earliest essays about peasants going into the forest to collect firewood, and they're getting beaten by the forest guards and arrested and tortured and so on, Marx writes about them, says that, the peasants who go into the forest to collect wood, he says they know their punishment. They're aware of their punishment. Their punishment is they get beaten. What they don't know is their crime. What have they done to get beaten like this? They know their punishment. They don't know their crime. Similarly, George Floyd, we know the punishment. He was killed, suffocated to death. But what was his crime? There is no crime there. Being alleged to pass a counterfeit bill, not a crime. What is the crime of Venezuela? This is a good question for people to ask. It's an analogous question. We know what the punishment is against Venezuela. Venezuela is being suffocated to death in the same way as George Floyd was suffocated in the streets of Minneapolis. There's a hybrid war against Venezuela. It's being detached from global financial markets. It's money sitting in the Bank of London. Its money, Venezuela's money, is stolen from it, and so on. So, it's being suffocated. But why is it being suffocated? We know the punishment being meted out to Venezuela. We don't know the crime. Well, the crime is Venezuela has the indecency, just as the movement for socialism, government led by Evo Morales in Bolivia, had the indecency to conduct a project of resource socialism. In other words, these are poor countries that say we want to use our resources for socialistic ends, not to benefit global capitalist firms. And this itself, what they are doing, is a little bit like saying, let's move the police and let's get food to George Floyd or Eric Garner and so on. What the Venezuelan government is doing, Bolivian government is doing, is let's get the food to people. Let's not, put a military cordon to prevent people from eating. That's what Lula did in Brazil. They started a project to eradicate hunger. I mean, what kind of civilization can you claim to have if hunger is not at zero? Like in India, for instance, the question of hunger should drive every government. They should be much more interested in eradicating hunger than anything else. But no, that's not the case. That's not exactly what functions. So I'm going around in circles here, Chirashri, but I want to come back just to make the point sharply that as far as the political economy of imperialism or the domestic US state is concerned, there is a homologous relationship, which is that the use of force is necessary to prove a point, which is that private property, particularly private property held in Western hands, private property is far more important than the well-being of people. So you'll have a police officer in front of a market preventing George Floyd from eating, or you'll have a warship in front of Venezuela preventing medicines from entering that country. That is more important than the principle of the well-being of people. And I think that's how we've got to understand imperialism on a global stage. Again, I'm saying it in moral terms. I'll start with the two questions because I think they are related. One of them is, you were saying that the biggest task for the left is to be on the streets. Well, I wasn't exactly saying that. I was saying that for us, instinctively, the street is where we conduct our politics. But fair enough. But that requires solidarity. And this is the real point. Do you think that the labor movement in the United States at present stands united enough for this task? Or is the labor movement also marred by racial divisions, which prevent it from taking on a larger role? Somebody said the white worker's foot is on the neck of his black counterpart. So that's one question. The second question, resistance in the United States seems to be by and large race-based. So obviously the anarchists are also prominent. Do you see a Marxist consciousness possibly emerging? And what are the immediate steps the Marxist left should take? Okay, so I think these are related questions. I'll take them together. The first thing is that the US labor movement has not really been present in many of these protests, nor has it been present in the kind of activity, around the coronavirus relief. It's a stark difference between, say, the trade union movement in India and the trade union movement in the United States. And some of that has to do with the fact that in India, in Kerala, for instance, the trade union movement is politicized. It's a political movement. So the entry of unions into the public domain, into public action to provide relief for people and so on, that actually is that's an imperative. That's something that the union movement understands that it must do. It's not a choice. In the United States, on the other hand, trade union movement has largely been depoliticized. It has been what Lenin called, it has entered into the domain of economism. So it's basically wage bargaining and labor condition bargaining units, not so much a political unit. So they are not capable of public action, or have not produced public action of the scale necessary. Why didn't the unions in the United States come on the streets in large numbers and feed people, or make sure that the elderly were getting their medicines and so on? Conduct public relief in a non-state way. Ironically, in these capitalist democracies where public action has been destroyed by and large, they are more reliant on state relief than in China. In China, which is criticized for being authoritarian, but of course, if you look at it closely, it's not authoritarian, because China has a well-developed public action infrastructure. There are neighborhood committees, there are all kinds of public action groups and so on. So in one province in China, there were 400,000 volunteers. They didn't volunteer for the state to bring them out into providing relief. They volunteered in neighborhood groups, in youth groups, and so on. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, that trade unions in the United States have become pretty much an economistic political platform. In other words, they are fighting for wages and working conditions. Very important work, necessary work, but they're not sufficiently political. So I don't think one can even judge the role of the trade unions in this particular struggle, because they have not been out there publicly. It's also not actually true that the anarchists are prominent in this struggle. I think it's far more important to point to young black and brown women and men and precarious workers who are joining them. These protests are not race-based. There are lots of people from different communities on the streets, outraged by the situation. And I think what the government feared the most is that the protests would escalate from Black Lives Matter to the system is broken. I think that is the most dangerous escalation. So they tried to make it not about that and tried to say this is rowdy anarchists and so on. But in fact, the tendency of this protest continues to go in that direction, from Black Lives Matter to, the system is broken. There is a current of Democrats who attempt to say, get Trump out, Biden comes in, everything is solved. But I don't think that's credible for a lot of these young people. It's also important to know that the socialist movement, the Democratic Socialist Organization, DSA, Democratic Socialist Association, Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, is growing. It's important to know that other left formations, Party for Socialism and Liberation and so on, they are growing. And their growth, I think, has to be understood as part of their intense activity on the streets at this time. So now, is it possible for a Marxist consciousness to emerge? I mean, it's premature to talk about that, because first you need to see where this cycle of protests will go, whether it will move from Black Lives Matter towards taking account of the great suffering in the pandemic, whether it will move in that direction, which will call into question the system. I think that's where we have to see how it goes. And if it goes in that direction, then the left groups can enter and play a much sharper role, like the Democratic Socialists of America. You see, right now, they are much smaller. They're not an enormous mass organization, but they play a key role. So if the movement radicalizes, they will have a role. I just want to say next week, Tricontinental will release a text which is called Corona Shock and something of potential of socialism. And what it shows is it looks at the way in which the governments of Vietnam, Cuba, Venezuela, and Kerala have responded to the Corona shock. And it's an indirect comparison with United States, Brazil, United Kingdom, and so on. And on every metric, Vietnam, which has had no fatalities, Kerala, Cuba, and Venezuela looks better than these other countries. So that's the first set of questions. Are you optimistic about China's economic transformation? Where should we place China in a friend-enemy political spectrum? Okay. In their books, Eva Ong and Ananya Roy demonstrate how Chinese state is implementing neoliberalism in the name of communism. Well, and Levin Ahmed has written just like India's CPIM. That's interesting. I have a few things to say about that. It's not my view that the Chinese are implementing neoliberalism. I think that's a rather shallow way of looking at what's happening in China. By the way, if you look at the statements made by Xi Jinping in recent years, you will find, in recent months, you will find the commitment to eradicating poverty is incredible. I mean, they are spending enormous amounts of money of their very precious resources to eradicate poverty. In 2016, I believe there was a television program on Chinese television which showed children of the Yi minority group rappelling down a cliff face in a cloth ladder to get to their school. This disturbed the Chinese population that, these children was doing such a dangerous thing to get to school. So at that time, Xi Jinping made a big speech saying we need to create infrastructure to so-called modernize life for at least the national minorities. And in that particular case, they built a steel ladder. Now, that may not have been the most effective thing. They could have done it differently, but they built a steel ladder. They made it easier for children to get to school and so on. An immense number of people, and there are debates about the exact numbers, are being pulled out of poverty in China. In fact, the Financial Times, no great friend of China, recently, just about 10 days ago, ran a very long article about poverty eradication in China. Poverty eradication comes alongside hunger eradication. And I can just tell you that a country today that is ending poverty, committed to ending poverty and committed to ending hunger cannot be called a neoliberal country at all. That is not sufficient as a designation. Now, there may be lots of problems in China, that's fine, but to give it a label like that without analytical specificity seems to me lazy. And I don't want to say that of the scholars you mentioned, but I think that approach is lazy. Because how do you, if you're a scholar of China today, how do you bring together, let's say, the eradication of poverty, commitment to ending hunger, this entire trajectory? How do you put that alongside, Shenzhen, for instance, the free trade area in Shenzhen? You have to find a structure to integrate all of this. And if you just take what's happening in Shenzhen and you say that's the way to understand China, that's ridiculous. That's like the blind and the elephant, where somebody says this, somebody says that. And by the way, even that blind and elephant is a ridiculous story because, people who are visually impaired don't have just a small understanding of the world. They are capable of a full understanding of the world. So even that is an offensive thing. And I'm sorry I mentioned that. But what I just mean is that if you take Shenzhen and study all of China through Shenzhen, you'll get a very tiny picture of what's going on. That would be like, going to, let's say, that mall, forgotten the name of it, just across the road from JNU, and you do an ethnography of that mall, that hideous mall, just across the road from JNU, and you say that's India, and you say that defines India. Well, it certainly doesn't define India. So I think this is not, to throw a label on China for this without trying to grapple with this other side of Chinese state policy, it's not going to help you. China, is it a friend or an enemy? Well, I don't look at the world like that. I like to understand what are the dynamics taking place. And I think China right now has been attempting to pivot away from its reliance on the global supply chain going to the West. And it had been trying to pivot away through the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. But certainly China is facing trouble now because global trade volumes are down by about 30% and sitting flat. China exports a lot of its goods. The internal market can't absorb everything. So there are some challenges before the Chinese government. But I think they're also using this opportunity because they still sit on a surplus for some income transfers inside China. So let's see what happens. Let's observe this closely. We just finished a meeting. We just saw the Chinese government have a meeting about, I think, 2-3 weeks ago. And at the meeting, they again committed themselves to poverty eradication. Very interesting. I don't know when the last time we've heard a government in India have a full meeting committed to poverty eradication or eradicating hunger. I haven't seen that. That crack about the CPIM doing neoliberalism, I suppose that might be related to the last CPIM government in West Bengal, most likely. That kind of thing is interesting, but let's be clear. The Communist Party of India, Marxist, of which I am a member, has never been in state power over the Indian state, and therefore has never been able to define the direction of Indian state policy. Governing a state, even in Kerala or West Bengal, doesn't give you the latitude to drive an entire policy. In fact, I highly recommend a book that Leftword published about fiscal federalism, which has an essay by Comrade Thomas Isaac, the finance minister of Kerala. It's an excellent book, excellent essay on how finances of states are constrained, and states which want to deliver social goods to people just simply don't have the means to raise the finances for it. Financing for development cannot be done on a state-by-state basis. So I'd like you to pay attention to that, because I'm familiar with this sort of line. It's not exactly correct. It's not a good way to understand the history of the CPIM in the last period. Okay, if you can talk a bit on the expansion of prisons in the US while targeting black people falsely, and how is it systematic racism has inspired BJP to establish detention centers, caste, sexuality, so on. Good, correct. I'd like to get to that. If you remember the geography I talked about, here's a shop, here's a police officer, here's a hungry person. The prison is part of this geography that incredibly, rather than provide a social life to a human being who has not committed a violent crime, rather than provide a social life, to use funds to create a social life, countries like the United States prefer to build prisons and imprison people in them. You see, there are several ways to take away somebody's liberty. Let's say I'm desperately trying to survive my family and so on, and I enter the drugs trade. I'm a simple seller of drugs on the street. I sell marijuana, I sell other things. I'm selling drugs on the street, I get arrested, I get thrown in prison. Now, why am I being thrown in prison? I'm being thrown in prison because the law has been vindictively targeted against me because I'm seen as a threat to society. But in fact, I am merely a symptom of complete social collapse because my horizons have so narrowed that I can't find anything to do apart from selling drugs on the street. I haven't had adequate education. I often have not had adequate nutrition. I'm not able to, operate productively. So instead of putting me in prison for 10 years and then I come out of prison with no real skills, I probably go back to selling drugs again, go back to prison. I might end up spending 20, 30 years in prison in my life. Rather than invest in me as a prisoner, you see, the state makes an investment in me. Either they make an investment in me to be a productive person. You increase nutrition to people. You increase education to people. You improve people's health conditions. That's an investment in me to become a productive member of society. Rather than invest in me at the front end, education, health, my well-being, food, and so on, rather than invest in me in the front end, you don't invest in me here. And you therefore push me into a situation where I have to break the law, and then you invest in my incarceration. You're investing in me one way or the other. You either invest in me to make me a productive person, or you invest in me to be a prisoner. Either way, social surplus is invested in the person. It's not like government has withdrawn investment in people. It's just decided, it's made a moral decision to invest in me at this end as a prisoner rather than as a person. And the reason you've done this is because you feel that if I get too much investment, if I'm spending too much money here and there are no jobs available, because the capitalist crisis has demonstrated that there are increasing numbers of surplus people, then I will be an educated person with aspirations who might start to agitate to change the system. It's dangerous to have people educated. So you're not investing in me to become a person. If I become a person, I might understand that this system is not operating to my end. I have aspirations now, proper aspirations. I don't want to merely survive. I want to live as a human being. I'm a person now. I'm healthy. I'm eating well. I'm educated. I want something from the world. I'm not trying to say that people who are not educated, who are not well fed, who are not healthy, don't have aspirations for the world. Don't misunderstand me. I'm saying that there is a danger in creating a different kind of aspiration, different set of aspirations. Far better to deprive people than a section of those people is going to commit a crime and then you invest in them as prisoners. So there is enough social surplus to move from investment in prison to investment in the person. But if you're going to do that, you're going to have to change the political economy. This requires transformation. You can't reform your way out of this. And I think the organizers of capitalism understand this. They understand that there is a tendency here for revolutionary consciousness to increase if they invest in human beings to become people. This is a dangerous trajectory. Far better not to do that investment and then throw people in prison. That seems, at least empirically, we see that that's the tendency, not only in the United States, but in all advanced capitalist democracies. They all have a tendency not to invest in human beings, but to invest in them as criminals. They all have this tendency. You see rising use of police violence and imprisonment of people. This becomes a default option in a so-called democracy, because democracy can justify that through using the language of crime or criminality or sedition or whatever the hell they want to say. But it's harder to justify if you have well-fed people who are healthy and educated and can't find jobs. That's much more complicated, because that shows that the system is basically sclerotic. It has failed. It is, completely had a heart failure. And I think that's the reason why there is this denial of service at this end and an increase of service at the other. I want to come to this question of caste, sexuality, and so on. It is also beneficial in a way for capitalist democracies to utilize all kinds of prejudices based in whether it's religion in India, anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Kashmiri sentiment, anti-gay sentiment, anti-trans sentiment, anti-misogyny, deep misogyny. It's easy for capitalist democracy to mobilize old social hierarchies to contain social discord. Just look at this pandemic. There's been an increase of violence against women. There's been a retreat of any kind of gender advances in many households. There's violence against children in the households. This idea of online learning is a fantasy. How many people with 3 children have 3 computers? How many people have access to the internet and so on? This is a ridiculous idea that digital education, it's not digital education, it's a digital divide. So in that sense, these social hierarchies are mobilized by advanced democratic capitalist societies as a way to contain society. If you can keep social discord alive, then the assumption is that social anxieties and problems will remain in society. They don't offer a challenge to the state. And I think that's a very useful way for advanced capitalist societies to let the social discord simmer. Let it be on racial lines. You can make some holy statement saying, we are whatever it is, liberated in the sense that we are against homophobia. You can make some statement. Corporation can run some advertisements, but this is not going to necessarily transform the depth of homophobia inside society. In fact, it's just an ad, another ad. Just like an ad for Coca-Cola, you have an ad for gender sensitivity or sensitivity towards homosexuals and so on. It's not taken seriously because you're not trying to do anything in society. I'll give you an example from Kerala, for instance. I thought it was quite significant that the local government in Kochi decided that the Kochi metro ticket collectors would be from the transgender community. I think that's a very interesting policy, because that, firstly, it gives income to people from the transgender community, but secondly, it's important because it then suggests that the transgender community is going to come in daily contact with society, other aspects of society. People have to engage then on a, in this case, on basically a ticket buyer, ticket collector relationship, which is, which familiarizes different communities with each other. That takes the hierarchies in society and tries to disrupt them. That's different from a corporate ad saying, we celebrate pride. Well, that's just an ad. You're not doing anything in society. You actually keep social discord alive in order to prevent any kind of direct challenge to the state. How do you compare India with the West in terms of social consciousness? I like this question. Last-minute polarization has been upstaging popular sentiment, killing the very spirit of democracy. How do popular groups deal with this? I like this question because the idea of spirit of democracy is important. The spirit of democracy, if you read the great old European theorists of politics like Hegel, democracy is a spirit. I mean, it sort of is like a fog. It sits over society. I mean, I'm not keen on the idea spirit of democracy. It's not a spirit. They are a set of practices, and they are things people do. As Marxists, we are more interested in the question of praxis in a way than we are in ideas as abstractions. The spirit of democracy, unless there are a set of practices that constantly reproduce the habits of democratic action, these habits will go, and then the spirit of democracy becomes ideological. It becomes just an idea. People will say we are a democracy. Like in India, people will say we are a democracy. Seriously, it's a democracy? I mean, what makes India a democracy? If you don't have the practices of democratic action, if you don't have the habits of democratic action inculcated generation after generation, how is it a democracy? The attack, for instance, against arrests of people like Anand Teltumbe and Gautam Navlakha and the whole lot of other people, Sudha Bardwaj and others, on sedition grounds. That is an assault not on the spirit of democracy but on the habits of democratic action. It chills action. When students in universities are trying to conduct their political lives, when they're trying to inculcate habits of democratic action, and you smash them down and you tell them, no, your job is to study, not to waste time on politics, that's where you're killing democracy. And democracy in places like India have been killed a long time ago, because the idea, the practices of democratic action have been considered to be a threat to the state. So public action, except in pockets around the country, is discouraged. And anytime you see people very bravely in large numbers come out, we all feel happy and excited. Like the Kisan Long March, for instance, a very good example. That somehow lifted the spirits of so many middle-class people who had seen in their own lives the habits of democratic action go to zero. Essentially zero, because people know intuitively going to vote in an election every 5 years or whatever, that's hardly democratic action. That's simply voting. Voting is not democratic action. The habits of democratic action have to be reproduced almost in a daily way. You've got to learn to be out on the street. You've got to learn to write pamphlets. You've got to learn to go and campaign amongst people and so on. That's the habits of democratic action. In fact, that then produces the spirit of democracy. So, in places like the United States, where you have this upsurge, this punctual cycle of protests. Unless this cycle of protest generates habits of democratic action, in other words, people join and form organizations, they continue to campaign on streets, they continue to write pamphlets, they continue to raise awareness, unless that sort of dull work of politics is maintained between these punctuated cycles of protest, the habits of democracy wither away. So that's how I would put it. I mean, the reason I fundamentally believe in the importance of a political party, the reason I fundamentally believe in the importance of mass organizations isn't for necessarily just for what they say, their line and so on. I believe in them because of what they do, which is that they inculcate the habits of democratic action over and over again. That's why even during the pandemic, it was so important to have demonstrations. People came out, held a sign, I am against the new labor law, stood 6 feet apart and so on. We are against the labor law. That is the habit of democratic action. The right wing actually doesn't inculcate the habit of democratic action. They inculcate the habit of intimidation. Their mobs come out and try to intimidate people. And you can see the difference of politics, not in what they say only, but also in how they do things. You know, they come because their actions are pogrom based. The left comes because its actions is democratic based. China's new citizenship law has raised the voice of Hong Kong people, as the law says any act in the name of free speech and criticism of the government will be under bars. Does this policy of a communist government, one of the most popular nations in the world, is also fascist governance? We are shouting here saying our government is like a fascist, but what about this country and the government? The law firstly says that there should be no separate law for Hong Kong against China. That after 1997, a separate system was allowed, and now we are, what are we, 33 years later, that there needs to be rethinking of what's going on. You can have free speech, but you cannot allow, they say, and we can have a debate about this, that any political platform created in Hong Kong cannot take foreign money. This is an interesting thought. Should not take foreign money. So as soon as this law came into effect, most of the pro-democracy groups had to shut down because many of them are funded by either American foundations or others. So this is an issue. It's a debatable issue. Should a country, a sovereign country, allow foreign money to come in to finance political organizations inside that country? That's a debate. You should debate it, whether that is important or not. In the left in India, this has been a long-standing debate, whether NGOs that are foreign funded, whether that's okay. Now, I would make a difference between groups that, do, let's say, some relief work or whatever, and a political organization. I think it would be questionable whether political organizations should receive funds from abroad. I think that's a fair question that can be asked and debated and discussed. That's actually what's going on. It's not that you can't say what you want, but you can't be funded by entities abroad. I mean, there's also the question on the table, I think it's worthwhile asking, whether a government is going to tolerate organizations that call for its overthrow. This is, I think, a reasonable debate and question to ask. I mean, the CPIM, for instance, is committed to multi-party democracy. But if you have a socialist transformation, if you're moving towards socialism, are you going to allow a political party that is committed to overthrowing the socialist government? It's a good question to ask. In Venezuela, for instance, the government did not ban, even though it's a socialist party that's in power, they have a socialist dynamic they're trying to drive. They have not banned the right-wing parties. They've allowed them to remain. And those right-wing parties are Trojan horses for US imperialism. That's another debate and question to have. These are things that are on the table. I don't think your question opens the debate up. It shuts it down because it defines what's happening in China without trying to study and understand what is actually going on, which is an attempt to bring Hong Kong as a juridical entity into the framework of Chinese law. As I said, when the Indian Army went into Goa, what was the reaction of people in India? I mean, you welcomed the end of Portuguese colonialism. In the same way, this is also a sort of decolonization of Hong Kong, which was taken by the British over 100 years ago, handed over notionally 30 years ago, and now the Chinese are increasing the integration of Hong Kong into China. Again, this is an open debate question. Should the Indian government have entered Portuguese-controlled Goa in 1961, or should they have allowed it to be one country, two systems? Have had a sort of Portuguese, system allowed for Goa, and Goa treated differently than the rest of the country? I mean, I'm not sure that that's easy for a government to sustain. Now, this of course raises the question of Kashmir, and I'm not willing to be a hypocrite here. I understand that you would think of Kashmir immediately here, because after all, when the Articles of Accession were signed and Kashmir, entered in its own way the Indian Union, there was Article 370 and so on, which gave Kashmir a special status. So should you say, well, if in China they've revoked the special status of Hong Kong, is it acceptable for Kashmir's special status to be revoked? There's a big difference here. Hong Kong was an entity controlled by colonial power, which had a lease for 100 years. And as a part of the terms of the transfer of the lease back to China in 1997, 100 years later, the British pushed to have a special system to protect Hong Kong. But that, in the framework of the accession back to China, that was not necessarily going to be permanent. At the time, the Chinese saw value in Hong Kong having this system, because they wanted Hong Kong to preserve its financial markets. Now that seems to be no longer necessarily the case. It's different than the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, because in Jammu and Kashmir, in a sense, the Jammu and Kashmiri polity, which of course was not democratic, it was a Maharaja, acceded to the Indian Union. And it's my view that that accession to the Indian Union should have had a democratic character right then in the 1940s. There should have been a discussion with the Kashmiri people. That didn't happen. That was suffocated. And that is why now you have, for every 7 Kashmiris, 1 Indian army person in that state, which, if you were to have a political scientist do some sort of formula, and you had to talk about an occupation of a people, I wonder what the formula would be. Is it acceptable to have 1 security officer for 7 civilians? Is it 1 security officer for 3 civilians? At what point do you tip the scale from having it be a internal security question to an occupation? And I think the Indian people need to ask ourselves whether, if you have 1 army person for 7 Kashmiris, if this is not indeed an occupation, and the debate needs to open up again with the Kashmiri people about what should be the future of Kashmir. I think that to shut that down is also a wrong thing. So that's how I would answer that, or at least raise some questions. How do you compare India with the West in terms of social consciousness? The United States doesn't actually have a simple electoral system. I think that's important to understand. There's no simple way to explain this electoral system. This electoral system was set up in order to advantage, rural areas and states that had enslaved human beings. And so they created the system of the electoral college, which means that there is no real election in the 50 states of the United States. There's actually, because most of the states are highly polarized, and you know what they'll vote for. Like New York State will vote for the Democrats. Most of the Midwestern states will vote for Republicans, and so on. So there is an divide. Like Georgia will go to the Republicans, Massachusetts will go to the Democrats. These are all stable. There are just a handful of what are known as swing states, 4 or 5 states: Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and so on. 4 or 5 states. The rest of the country, it's already divided, and they don't even really campaign elsewhere. There's no real election. They campaign in these swing states. In these swing states, the condition of deprivation is quite deep, and it's going to take a lot of campaigning by Joe Biden, who's a very poor campaigner in the current situation for many reasons. It's going to take a lot of serious campaigning from Joe Biden to be able to counter Donald Trump, because Trump is clever. He's a very nasty campaigner. He went to South Dakota on the 4th of July to, what's that called, Mount Rushmore, where there's the sculptures of the US presidents. And he made a very dark and dangerous speech about evil forces trying to destroy America. This is what he does when his back is against the wall. He'll use very racially charged language, language against liberals and communists, and language against threats to the country, which are often racialized. Black and brown bodies, migrants coming across the border. So you have brown migrants coming across the border, black bodies thieving from you, communists coming and taking away your liberties, and so on. This very gloomy picture he paints terrifies sections of the population who have had a history of anti-communism and racism, a 100-year history to pull against. And Trump then takes these divides in society, these are what you might call wedge issues, and constructs them to his benefit. And he's trying to push that politics in this election. And in these few swing states, it's possible that he's able to turn enough people through fear and fear-mongering and so on his side. Secondly, he is going to most likely extend the payments to unemployed, and not only unemployed, but to people under a certain income bracket. $600 checks will come to them. I think he's going to extend this after July. He knows that this is a campaign issue. This is not an issue of human suffering. He's not motivated by human suffering. He wants to be reelected. So most likely he'll do that. And that is debt into the American exchequer. It doesn't matter to him. He doesn't have to raise the money. So this is how he actually might win in this election. Joe Biden is a very poor candidate at this time. He seems to not be able to focus very well, and that has an impact. It creates indigestion among people and so on. Also, he has made a mistake because he's tried to disassociate himself from the protests that have come up now to some extent. Some of it he's tried to incorporate, but he's disassociating. And this means that the left and the liberal left may not feel enthusiastic in this election. So it's really not clear what's going to happen, and hard to make any kind of future judgment. I want to say a few things about the US thing on China. The escalation of rhetoric is very dangerous, and I think India is getting swept into this for unnecessary reasons. India, of course, not only is there the dispute with China at Galwan, but in the middle of this, India and Nepal have the dispute at Kalapani. Again, another issue that should be settled at the diplomatic table over a map. These things should be settled, but no, they are not. And the Kalapani dispute with Nepal is linked to the India-China issue. Yesterday the Nepalese Communist Party had a meeting. There's a crisis. They are also worried that a lot of corona-infected people are coming across the border from India. They are worried India might start another embargo and so on. They are deepening their relations with China. I mean, this is a very fraught thing, and they are getting pressure from the United States government to take the Millennium Challenge grant. They found uranium in the Mustang region, which is on the border with China. The United States very interested in that uranium deposit. There's a lot of flashpoints in South Asia in the middle of the US attempt, both technologically and politically, in military terms, to push on China. United States has developed this hypersonic cruise missile, which can reach anywhere in the planet in 1 hour, fired whether from US territory. And if they are able to fire it from a submarine just off the coast of Taiwan, for instance, they can hit Beijing in under 15 minutes. These kind of weapons have made détente or deterrence impossible, because they've just cut down on the time that is needed for a weapon, dangerous, lethal weapon, to hit a target. You can't retaliate. That's going to get harder, which is why the Japanese now are talking about developing a first strike capability. So on the technological front, the United States has developed a lot of new weapons, which are very dangerous and will destabilize whatever mild form of deterrence exists in the world today. So that's the first side, the technological side. Politically, the US is building up this Indo-Pacific strategy, which includes the Quad countries, Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, and is using these countries to put pressure on China. This is totally unhealthy for the whole Asian region. What I'm saying is that this is a very dangerous time with the US using every means to put pressure on China, to use extra economic force, this whole blaming China for the coronavirus, which is ridiculous. And on our Tricontinental website, we have a text called China and Corona Shock, which I really hope you'll read. It goes over the timeline, shows there was no suppression of information and so on. I hope you'll read that. There is no future for India without having a negotiated relationship with China. There's just no future. It's a miscalculation to believe that hitching the Indian horse to the American horse is going to advance Indian interests. It's a total miscalculation. I think it's far more important to talk about an Asian project. And this doesn't mean one is pro-China, anti-American. It's not about that. It's understanding what are the dynamics towards a peaceful world and dynamics towards militarism. You know, hitching with the Americans from 2005 nuclear deal onward brought India much more firmly into a tendency towards militarism. It's a very dangerous thing that happened from 2005 when India voted in the International Atomic Energy Agency meetings twice against Iran on behalf of the US government. It's a real miscalculation to have allowed that. And I'm proud of the fact that the left walked out of UPA 1 on this basis. It shows you that what happened when India fully became a subordinate ally. It's now willing to do US bidding to essentially rattle the Chinese cage. Very dangerous.